Testing the sound. So welcome everyone. The core of what I speak about, succinctly put, is happiness in daily living. In fact, everything that I'll share in this satsang is shared because it is relevant to that one topic, happiness in daily living. So, if the mind starts moving off, that's perfectly okay. In fact, some people won't resonate with this particular teaching. Everyone has their own flavor, and there are many different flavored teachings. But this comment I make is really important, and we'll see based on the next part of what I'm going to say. So the comment is, everything that is shared here is shared only because it is very relevant to happiness in daily living for the human being. And if we find ourselves seeking for something in life, sometimes for many years, often feeling frustrated, it can be very clear that seeking is happening. We've caught the bug. If the seeking is happening, doesn't it make sense to ask ourselves a question, a very important question? Ask the question and put some effort into getting a good answer for the question. Not just an answer that I put forward, because I'll put forward a suggested answer to the question, but then following the pointers to verify whether the answer is something that you like to hold on to as the answer that you've come up with for yourself. The question is, what am I really looking for? In practical terms, what is this seeking for? What do I hope to get? And the answer to the question, whether we realize it or not, this is the important, whether we realize it or not, is that human beings are seeking for one thing only. What I mean by humans are seeking for all sorts of things on the surface, but deep down, when we really look at it, humans are looking for one thing, and that is happiness in this life. Now, we might have quite a few beliefs in place that say, no, I'm not looking for happiness. And that's understandable. Life is very good at embedding beliefs in the human being. It's actually sort of, we could say, how we're designed to believe things that are presented to us. And to the extent that we believe something, meaning what I mean by belief is we take a concept and we relate to it as though it's absolutely true. And so in life, we're given a lot of concepts by our family, our friends, the political environment, the religious culture. And the human being hasn't been adequately equipped to relate to these conditionings as something relative, something that might not be as true as they're presented. And so the human being seems to have a deeply ingrained set of beliefs that causes quite a lot of problems in life. Not problems so much on a performance level, not so many problems based on outcomes. The deeply ingrained set of belief causes problem on a level that we can call a level of self. And the problem always lies in our attitude to life, meaning how we relate to what is happening. That's where the uncomfortableness that we find with life is located. It's located on the level of our attitude to life. The flow of life, meaning circumstance, is either pleasurable or painful. And the extent of the pleasure and pain in life can be quite extreme and varied. There's a spectrum in the flow of life: extreme pleasure, extreme pain, and everything in between. Life on a experiential level is a duality, and it's a duality of pleasure and pain, wealth and poverty, health and disease, big and small, male and female, interconnected opposites. Our uncomfortableness with oneself, with the other, and with life isn't found on the level of pleasure and pain. That we can call is the biological level. Pleasure and pain is the biological level of the human being. The suffering that we experience in life is on an attitudinal level, how we relate to what's happening in the flow of life. And so, whether we realize it or not, the human being is moving towards a state of happiness in life. The problem is that our ingrained belief of what happiness is wrong. If we look at human movement and our own movement, we'll see that our movement is telling us my happiness is to be found in outcomes. My happiness is to be found in circumstance. And the fact of the matter is, human happiness isn't dependent on circumstance, isn't dependent on outcomes. So if we go round with a false belief of where my happiness, my completeness is to be found, really what it means is we have a false idea, a false belief of who we are. And it's that false belief of who we are, the false belief of what life is, because that's not really the only error. There's a couple of interconnected errors. That false idea of who we are is what interacts with the flow of life. And it interacts in the flow of life in the form of an attitude to what's happening. And essentially, it finds life unacceptable. Because the flow of life is inevitably and always out of our control, always either pleasure or pain. And the amount of pleasure that we'll receive in our lifetime and the amount of pain that we'll receive in our lifetime, not in our control. Actually, one of the predominant concepts in this teaching is saying that life is a creation of source, a manifestation, an arising in consciousness. So a creation that we didn't create, but actually that we're intrinsically part of. And this creation, we could say, from the perspective of the human being, is predetermined to unfold exactly as it's created, not as we decide. We're part of the creation. So these words are not separate from the whole manifestation, or if we want to look at it, the manifestation as we're aware of it is this experience. Not bigger than that. Whatever arises inside your awareness is essentially, in practice, the manifestation in this moment, the creation in this moment. So if we can start to see that, okay, this is the manifestation, already a level of presence can start to happen. Awareness or presence, focus on this. The experience, the visual aspects, the sound aspects, the sense of touch and smell, the thoughts, the emotions. All of it arising and subsiding. Sound is an easy example of a sound arises and then subsides. And the experience is multi-dimensional, multi-experiential, and always changing. So that's not generally the view we have of life. It's not generally the view we have of ourselves. So that could be another part of the misunderstanding of who we are and the misunderstanding of what life is. The good news is that if there is misunderstanding, it's not our doing. It's not something I or you have created. It's intrinsically part of the moment, part of the experience of life. What this means is that whatever happens through the human being at any point in time is exactly that, a happening, and not my doing or your doing. This is the other part of the deeply ingrained false idea of who I am. The self-image of ourself is a separate, independent entity, disconnected from everything else, separate. And essentially the source is how we see ourselves, the source of everything that I think, everything I feel, and everything I do. And it's on that ground that our unhappiness as human beings arises. So in practical terms, unhappiness for the human being arises in the form of guilt, blame and pride, worry, anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. The question that I suggested that we ask ourselves if we find ourselves seeking, what is it that I'm really looking for? We might not get a good answer to this question straight away, but at times when we're really not happy, times when we can put our hand on our heart and say, I'm not sure what happiness for the human being is. That's why I'm seeking. I'm not even sure that I'm seeking happiness yet. But I can say, in this moment, I'm not happy. When that particular moment arises in our life. And if we take a look at that, we'll find that it arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and anxiety. That's what will be present. And if we're really honest with ourselves, when we're present with this uncomfortable feeling in one of those forms, we'll say, actually, I just want the end of this relationship to life. I just want this uncomfortable feeling to go away. That's when we get the real answer to the question, what am I really looking for in life? So those of you that have been seeking and had certain realizations about the nature of life and found that your peace of mind, because that's actually what happiness for the human being is in the end. It's not the happiness that we've come to believe it is. Happiness is not to be found in outcomes. We've been chasing outcomes for our whole life. It turns out that happiness for the human being is available in the form of continuous unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. And so for those of us that are finding more peace of mind coming into our life, and yet still finding this somewhat annoying process of flip-flopping, peace for a period of time, and in that the sense, this is it, I see life clearly, and a relaxation, a sense that life is just flowing, and we find ourselves unaffected with what is happening in life. Quite the contrast to how we might have reacted to unfortunate circumstance in the week before or the year before. And so when the flip is there, everything feels fine. Everything is fine. And yet the flow of life is still a mix of pleasure and pain. And then we wake up one morning and everything's changed. The flop has come upon us, and the smallest of things can seem like a big issue. And one of the benefits of this flip-flopping is for us to be able to finally exclaim for ourselves, based on our own observation, that actually what I'm looking for in life is just the end of suffering. I'm not looking for the dissolution of the person. I'm not looking for a oneness experience. In practical terms, I'm just looking for the end of the uncomfortableness that we know all too well, that subsides as part of this movement for periods of time. It demonstrates experientially what peace of mind and daily living feels like, what attitude can arise in the human being. What that means is what the potential of the human being is in relation to life as it unfolds moment after moment after moment. That gets shown to us in those periods of what we call flip, in the flip-flopping process. And even still, the human being has this odd capacity to be shown something time and time again and to not register it. So even with this flip-flopping, sometimes the peace isn't registered as precious as it is. We might still think that, oh yes, well, but that's a little too ordinary. What I'm really looking for is some very profound experience that is going to give me something. And we've heard time and time again that actually the realized state is extraordinarily ordinary. so simple. It's not at all what the mind that is looking for something, looking to gain something, it's not at all what the mind expects. That's another thing that you hear people that are sharing their experience say. It's not what I thought it was going to be. We also hear people say, you don't get anything. This is a process of removal. What is removed is the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. When that falls away, which is the ground on which the suffering arises, what is removed is the suffering. And what's revealed is the essence of the human being that was previously unregistered, unrecognized. It turns out to be, as far as happiness in daily living is concerned, the most important thing. That's why we hear people say, you are happiness. Because it's the very nature of the core of the human being to be happy, which means to be at peace with life as it unfolds, what is referred to as equanimity. Now, this equanimity isn't on a biological level. Equanimity on a biological level would mean sticking your hand under boiling water and noticing no difference between boiling water and warm water or cold water. So on a biological level, differentiation is still going to be there. Biologically, the intelligence of the body, because of this differentiation that is recognized biologically, movement in life will continue to happen. The equanimity is on the attitudinal level, that no longer takes life as an attack on who I am, knowing that what I am at my core remains unaffected, always complete and whole, regardless of the circumstance I find myself in. Now, believe me, if you believe this, actually don't believe me, because this movement is a movement away from belief. If you just believe what I'm saying, it will mean nothing. If we throw beliefs at life, hoping that the beliefs will make everything okay, thinking that I can throw beliefs at the circumstance and suddenly my attitude to it will change, it won't. So we know that when a resistance to life happens, and then we start throwing concepts at that resistance, they sort of fall flat. They just sort of like water off a duck's back, like rubber bullets that just hit a piece of metal and just fall to the ground. What does have an effect on suffering is the clear seeing of what is spoken about. The really clear observation of the various dynamics that I speak of. And one of the reasons that these dynamics aren't seen, even when they're heard, so some people listen to these teachings over and over and over again, and still it can take a long time before something clicks. And when it clicks, when it's actually seen, we notice this strange phenomenon. Wow, I've listened to this so many times, and until this moment, what was being said hadn't clicked. I thought I understood it. But at a certain point when something clicks, and I'm not talking about one single final click. There are lots of little clicks, insights we can say, all along the way that are contributing to an overall understanding, or more accurately, overall dissolution of misunderstanding. Because the clicks really are saying, oh, I can't believe what I used to believe anymore. I see now. I see clearly. I see the situation clearly. Just like the analogy of the rope in the shed that is taken to be a snake. Until it's seen to be a rope, we're convinced it's a snake. And then when it's really seen, oh, I really see it's a rope. You know, before the strands, the small pieces of rope, or the smaller rope that make up the bigger rope, with the light and everything, seemed like scales on a snake. That's all it looked like. And then when it shifts and we see, actually that's rope. I really see it. Then the illusion is over. And so what is being put forward here is not meant to be believed, but the good news is I'm talking about happiness in daily living. And most of what's spoken about is speaking about the dynamics of daily living. So you don't require a frame of reference from some esoteric point of view that's not available to you. This investigation can happen for anyone, because essentially I'm talking about looking at the table and the chair and the trees. Some parts not quite as tangible as that, like feelings, let's say, but still very tangible and available for observation in daily living without some special state. And the purpose, therefore, is for an investigation to happen for oneself, using the concepts, and that's all that is ever put forward, is a concept. No one has ever uttered a word of truth. Take the most highly respected sage in this town, and also for me, Ramana is a highly respected sage that was pointing towards truth. And yet, not a single word uttered was the truth. Everything ever said or written is a concept. And the teachings themselves tell you that. Don't mistake the pointing for the truth itself. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. I'll say that time and time again, maybe not time and time again in one satsang, but almost every satsang. That statement, if the mind clicks on, everything that is ever put forward is a concept, it is not the truth. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. So, why was that question that was suggested so important? What am I really looking for in life? Because if we know what we're looking for in practical terms, not esoteric terms, but practical terms, we can then start investigating that topic without going off in all sorts of different directions. And if our investigation becomes focused, it makes sense that we're less likely to find ourselves as a frustrated seeker many years after having started the search. The strange thing is that this question hasn't necessarily been asked. Or if it's been asked, we've settled for the answer someone else is giving us, or a word, enlightenment. If we're going to have a word, let's know what the word actually means in practical terms. Otherwise, we're just chasing after or working towards, or even if the wisdom starts to kick in and that movement of seeking actively falls away and we start resting, we might be resting expecting something that's not quite available. An example of this is about going deep and recognizing the core of the human being, and then thinking that when that's been seen, having an idea that enlightenment is the complete dissolving into the nothingness, or the complete dissolving of the personal aspect, or the dissolving of the person. And so if that's our idea, what might happen is a movement of going deeper and deeper and deeper. Efforts put towards going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And maybe it's not about going deep and then going deeper and deeper and deeper. Maybe it's about going deep, recognizing, and then coming back out of the depths of a recognition of who we are at our core, coming back out and living as the human being, but this time always connected to Source, recognizing that we've never been disconnected from Source. Living as the human being means the personal aspect isn't going to dissolve. Not in totality anyway. What does dissolve is the belief in personal doership. And so what is often referred to as the person in spiritual teachings is not really referring to the entirety of the person, but is referring to the me as the doer, the me that needs this and that. So that dissolves, but the person in form remains. And in fact, an identification with the person remains. Now, once again, we have to be careful how we interpret certain words, because identification is often used in a sense where we only know ourselves as the person, and when we hear it that way, the person essentially means the body and the thoughts. So identification with the body, identification with thoughts and feelings, when it's referred to in another teaching, is talking about this one-sided view of how we know ourselves as a person, knowing ourselves only on a physical expression. The definition here of a person is impersonal consciousness of Source. You could say the one undifferentiated impersonal consciousness of Source that has linked or identified with a particular body-mind organism and is functioning through that body-mind organism. And so what we sometimes come to believe, because of how the path unfolds, so we receive teachings as and when they're needed, what we sometimes come to believe is it's that identification, that link to the body, and therefore the sense of an individual, which is the problem. So we're waiting for this identification to completely dissolve. So let's see that this word identification is being used two ways. The way I'm using it, linked to or identified with. Identification with name and a form. So impersonal consciousness linked to a particular body and functioning through that body as personal consciousness. That's a description of every human being, including an enlightened person. Impersonal consciousness of source linked to a particular body-mind organism, functioning through that body-mind organism. Meaning as personal consciousness, we can say. So the personal consciousness experience is referring to the experience that is there for a particular person, and it's from a particular perspective, the perspective of a particular object in life. And so Ramana's experience was still coming from a particular perspective in life. I'm not saying that he only knew himself as the body, but we see photos of him lying down reading the newspaper, meaning the experience in that moment was of newspaper, and the experience wasn't happening from the space. If someone were to come and cover his eyes, he would say, "Can't you see I'm reading the newspaper?" He wouldn't carry on reading the newspaper. He couldn't. Eyes have been covered. So life is still lived from the perspective of the individual. So there is still identification with a particular name and a particular form. If someone called his name, he would turn and ask, "Yes, how can I help you?" So what is the difference before enlightenment and after enlightenment? The concept here, and I speak from my own experience, so all that I'm putting forward is what my teacher shared in very much the same language. However, it's based on my direct experience. None of it is just an intellectual repeating of the concepts. So when I speak about continuous unbroken peace of mind as being the potentiality of the human being, when I say that what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, is actually simple happiness in daily living, which is the absence of suffering, the end of suffering, I'm speaking from my own experience. And so the definition of what will I have after enlightenment that I didn't have before is this. Before enlightenment, there was a person, or we can use the word ego. Once again, ego is being used differently for a very good reason. The word ego is referring to the combination of impersonal consciousness of source functioning through a particular body-mind organism, an instrument, and experiencing life from the perspective with all of the qualitative feel of this instrument. So, what is the difference between before and after? Before, there was a person, an ego, through which impersonal consciousness of source was functioning, with the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome. That deeply ingrained belief is contained on the level of the instrument, of the body. The impersonal consciousness of source doesn't think, it doesn't have preferences, it doesn't have feelings. Impersonal consciousness of source has two characteristics, maybe in their potential form, depending on how you look at it. And those characteristics are awareness, so the faculty or the function of awareness, and the sense of existence, the sense I am. And so when that consciousness or awareness source links to a particular body and functions through it, it illuminates the experience with those characteristics, and hence the experience which is dependent on awareness. We can't have an experience without awareness of the experience. And pervading through that experience is the sense I am, I exist. And when the experience includes the body as part of the experience, the sense is I am the person. There's absolutely no problem with the sense I am the person. That's not where suffering comes from. Suffering comes from the sense that I am exclusively the person, and only knowing the person as the gross aspects of the person. And the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes essentially arise simultaneous to that limited perspective of who we are. The belief I am the doer essentially creates a attitudinal separation. It sort of puts a ring around me, a mental vision of myself as being this object that is the orchestrator of everything that happens through the object. So there's a imagined me, an entity, a me entity that controls what happens through this body-mind organism. When we look at it, we can't find this me that creates all the reactions and the thoughts. It just doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. It's a fiction. The thoughts, the feelings, the emotions are happening spontaneously and automatically as a reaction to whatever happens in the moment. So the body, we could say, is designed based on biomechanics. It's a biological instrument. And on a hardware level, we can say it's based on its genetics. The genetics are what grow. So you have the egg and the sperm come together, and the body grows. At some point, arms start forming and legs and the body, and then the heart starts pumping at a certain point, and the liver starts filtering, and the brain starts functioning. Only when it grows to a certain point. And the infant, the baby, the fetus, isn't in control of that growth. It comes into existence because of growth. And the human adult is no different. It's a continuation of the growth. But not only is the hardware there, but the hardware gets programmed based on the circumstance that the hardware is exposed to. And the hardware is not separate from life at any point in time. So circumstance in life, plus all of the conditioning that society gives us, becomes part of what the human being is on a biological and psychological level. And so the thought you're having in this instant, in relation to what I'm saying, is a result of who you are in this particular moment, which is always changing slightly because the flow of life is continually adding to our up-to-date conditioning, what we could call the programming of the hardware. And the attitude that is included, the belief that is included, is generally speaking the belief I am the doer. So the thought which is spontaneously arising is related to as my thought, I created that. The deeply ingrained belief of personal doership actually really dislikes to hear this. It's an attack on who it believes itself to be. Remember what I mentioned at the beginning, whatever I put forward in this satsang is only shared because it is completely relevant to what we're really looking for, happiness in daily living. And so the phenomena whereby the belief in doership feels uncomfortable with what's being said makes complete sense. And so if the working mind, which is part of the person, part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, gets conditioned appropriately, the working mind starts to understand what is happening in daily living. And so that's why in these teachings we create a conceptual distinction between the working mind and the thinking mind. The thinking mind is the part of the brain that is conditioned with the false ideas of who we are. It's the thinking mind that generates the suffering. It's the thinking mind that generates the movement that is seeking for something out there, believing it's the doer and it has to achieve it. It's the thinking mind that has expectations about how life should look, has expectations about what it's looking for, has expectations about enlightenment. And all of that there because it's destined to be there as part of the creation of life. The thinking mind, as I said, doesn't like to hear that. The working mind, on the other hand, if the working mind registers what's being said, just a pointer, and it clicks, it looks at the experience, it looks at how we function in life, and it starts to see that actually, yes, I grew up in a family that told me X, Y, and Z is important. And as a result of that, I see my reaction to life when something opposite, for example, happens. Or I see my appreciation when life unfolds the way I've been conditioned to think it should. If we really see that there is not a single movement in the human being that is not based on these two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that I and you were not in control of. If the working mind gets this, this can be a tremendous relief. The load of guilt and blame that we carry around, which is our uncomfortableness, can fall away if this is really deeply understood. And when I say deeply understood, it's not necessarily going to happen in one foul swoop. It starts off as an intellectual understanding where someone can say, listen, I've heard what you've had to say, and I get it intellectually. I understand that what you're saying is that what I am on a biological and psychological level is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that I wasn't in control of, and that any movement in life happens as a result of the circumstance I find myself and my specific makeup at a point in time. I understand what you've said. If someone said that, I'd say, wow, you've really paraphrased me well. So I could say, I have no doubt that you have an intellectual understanding of what I've said, because you repeated it 15 minutes after I said it in such a way that your intellect grasped what I said. And they might say, I understand it intellectually, but I don't know this to be as accurate as you're putting forward. And that makes sense. How the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper is by life continuing to happen, meaning the human being continues to live life. They wake up in the morning, so this person goes to sleep tonight after satsang, wakes up in the morning, gets out of bed, gets ready for work, or gets ready to go for a walk up the mountain, and through the course of daily living, what is being pointed at starts being seen in such a way that it wasn't previously recognized. That means that the intellectual understanding is now seeing the dynamics that have been pointed at. And as it sees the dynamics, and it goes, wow, that's accurate, it puts a tick next to the concept. And once the concept has got 50 ticks next to it, meaning what has been described has been seen for oneself in one's own experience 50 times, then we can say that the understanding has gone very deep. Now I use that 50 times, it's arbitrary, it can be 2 times, can be enough for it to go to the point where I completely see what's being pointed at. It might need 100 ticks. I sometimes share a story to demonstrate how an intellectual understanding goes deeper about an event that happened here a few years ago while I was walking up the mountain. About 5 years ago, so this, or 10 years ago, so before the event I'm going to speak of, a friend had told me if you smile at a monkey, they'll take it as a sign of aggression. And at first I thought, that's strange, why would that be? And after a few moments of trying to figure out why that would be, it clicked. Oh, okay, smiling, you're showing your teeth. Yeah? And in monkey language, that's a sign of aggression. Like, we're going to fight. Or, I hate you, I'm going to kill you. And so it clicked in my head. Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. If I smile at a monkey, intellectually, I've been told, or conceptually, I've been told it's a sign of aggression. I had no reason to disagree or to not agree with intellectually that could be how it is, but I didn't believe it because I tend not to believe something just because someone told me. And then, several years later, I was taking a walk, and on one of the rocks there was a baby monkey, but really baby. I must have been 3 months old, or 3 weeks old even. The features were so fine, it was so small, and it had no sense of fear. It wanted to play. It was sort of, I almost thought it was going to jump on to me and play. It had its hand out. And I was looking at it, and I was really touched. And I had this warm feeling in my heart, and a smile came to my face. And the monkey screeched and jumped back about 2 meters. And for a second I went, that's strange. And then I remembered, if you smile at a monkey, they're going to take it as a sign of aggression. And I went, of course. And not only did the monkey, the baby 3-week-old monkey, jump back a meter, but the mother came rushing over, ready to fight. So it heard the baby's screech and came rushing over. And so what had happened is my intellectual understanding had now gone deeper based on my own observation, my own experience, not just what someone had told me and not what just something I believed. And just to play with it a little bit, I smiled at a few more monkeys over the next few days or weeks, and I got various different responses, which meant that my understanding, so one monkey, this was on a bridge, and it was a big monkey, and instead of jumping away, it jumped towards me. It wanted to, it said, okay, if you want to fight, I'll fight. So I jumped back. Got another tick next to the concept. My understanding went a little deeper. Then I smiled at a monkey that was out on a suspension wire on the same bridge, and it was eating. And it couldn't care less that I was smiling at it. It figured, I'm more interested in food, and that human is over there and he can't get me out here. And he was right. And so my intellectual understanding went a little deeper. Because I know now the concept is, it's not that if you smile at any monkey, they're going to get aggressive with you. There's some situations where it doesn't happen. So the understanding becomes more full based on your own investigation. And if I continued smiling at monkeys in different situations, I'd become an expert at monkey behavior in relation to smiles. If we become an expert in relation to the landscape of the human being relative to happiness in daily living, it means that our understanding of life, the understanding of who we are, has gone deeper and deeper and deeper. And automatically, as the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper, what happens is it uproots the misunderstanding that is lodged in the body. And when the understanding is total, it would have uprooted all of the misunderstanding. So a total understanding is not really a whole lot of knowledge that we've acquired. It's not our expertise in human environment. Total understanding is actually the upheaval, the emptying out of all the misunderstanding. And frankly, when the misunderstanding has been emptied out, your intellectual understanding, the capacity to talk about it, can also fall away. It's not about a new belief system being put in place. Our freedom doesn't come by replacing one belief system with a new belief system. Our freedom comes from that which is covering up our core being and continually filling the space with the different forms of suffering falling away. Our freedom comes with that which fills the space with uncomfortableness falling away. To become an expert in this landscape doesn't take that much, actually. If you listen to a few satsangs, you'll get the whole conceptual framework delivered to you. What I'm putting forward is a conceptual explanation of human unhappiness, why it's there, an explanation of life, and an explanation of how human unhappiness can end and on what basis it ends. There are some more supporting concepts that fit into the framework. And so once you've listened to the framework 5 or 6 times, intellectually, you'll understand the framework. I say this because the concepts are not rocket science. So we don't need to have a brain that is capable of understanding very complex physics or mathematics. And once the framework is put in place, the deepening happens without you having to devote any time to spiritual practice. It will happen as you're living life, doing whatever it is you're destined to do in each moment. It can deepen while you're going to work, while you're working, while you're raising a family, whilst you're on holiday, whilst you're on pilgrimage, spiritual seeking. The framework has become part of the working mind. The working mind is the functional part of the intellect. And freedom is not the end of thinking. Freedom is not the end of the mind. Freedom is the end of the thinking mind. Freedom is the end of the thinking which in practical terms is uncomfortable. An uncomfortableness with who we are and what the other is, because we're relating to life as it happens, as an attack on who I am, and it's just an attack on the belief of who I am, and we're relating to life, here's the important part, which we haven't really touched on that much, as if I'm the doer and the other is the doer, and therefore whatever happens through this body that delivers negative outcomes, whatever happens through this body that delivers pain in the moment to myself or someone I love or even a stranger, I will, with the deeply ingrained belief in personal doership, relate to as my doing, have the attitude that I should have and I could have done it differently and better, and I will judge myself, effectively hate myself. Guilt and shame. And when the flow of life unfolds through the other functioning as they are designed to function and delivering sometimes pain to me, when that pain is delivered, I will see the other as the doer and say, you hurt me, I hate you. Attitudinally. That's what blame is. And when life functions through me and the outcome is positive, I will, on the same principle, see that outcome as my doing and feel pride. If an investigation following the concepts that are put forward recognizes that how I function in each moment is based on how I am in that moment on a biological and psychological level, and both my biological and psychological is based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, the psychological on a very particular part of our up-to-date conditioning, the belief in doership and attachment to outcome. If the working mind sees that, understands that, then the load of guilt and blame, the load of shame and hatred falls away. The attitude to oneself and to the other as a doer falls away. Then life is seen as a happening. It's seen that sensations arise in a body-mind organism. Actions arise through a body-mind organism. Not my doing, and yet they happen. Not my doing, and yet they're experienced from the perspective of them being my actions. They still continue to be experienced as something that is part of the experience I'm aware of. And the absence of the belief in personal doership doesn't absolve us of responsibility. Society will continue to punish us or reward us based on whether the actions that happen through us are pleasurable or painful. However, our responsibility to God doesn't exist. God will never judge us for what we've done. God has become the manifestation. God has become the victim and the perpetrator, the sky and the ocean and the trees. If there was a separate God, he would understand that everyone in each moment is functioning exactly the way that they have been created to function. Where is the question of punishing someone for what they have done? What we spend our life doing is punishing ourselves and the other because of a false belief in personal doership. And if we don't fear God, we can love God. If we don't judge ourselves, we can love ourselves. If judgment happens, if blame happens, if guilt happens, why is it happening? It's happening because of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, not something we were in control of. So this understanding doesn't resist the suffering that is happening, doesn't create an extra layer of suffering that says, I shouldn't be creating blame, which would be another layer of suffering, guilt. If that happens, mind you, that too is based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if the working mind understands this principle on some level, there will be a witnessing of the flow of life as a happening, not my doing. And also, it will witness the attitude to the flow of life, meaning the suffering, if it's arising, also as a happening. It understands that the human being functions automatically, and it might come to see that the human being with the deeply ingrained attachment to outcomes, meaning the belief that my happiness, my fullness, my completeness is to be found in circumstance in the future, and the striving for that is also a huge layer of suffering. And at some point, the working mind will start cutting off the thinking mind. Not something we as a doer have to do. I have to start cutting off the thinking mind. It'll start happening automatically as the understanding goes deeper and deeper. If the thinking mind is seeking for outcomes, has an imagination of what needs to happen in the next week, and is working very hard for that, in working very hard for that, if it's coming from the thinking mind, the working mind and awareness will recognize the suffering in that, the uncomfortableness in that. And a thought might arise, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. That thought can cut off the thinking mind. And hopefully, what has also started to become familiar to us is the core of our being, a place that we can drop into and live from. And so as the working mind cuts off the suffering, we drop into being and realize, here I am. I had forgotten. I'm already complete, here and now. The forgetting is simply the functioning of the thinking mind that is saying what I am requires life to look a certain way, and I'm the one that has to make that happen. So let me put all my attention on that. And once the working mind starts to recognize all of the different forms of suffering, there's about 5 or 6 different forms of suffering, and under those headings, guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome, there are sub-versions of suffering. Like under guilt we can have lack of self-worth, insecurity, guilt for something simple that we did, like we forgot to repay someone some money, or maybe we didn't forget, we intentionally overlooked it, and then a sense of guilt about that functioning. And blame can be resentment, hatred, judgment. Simple blame for someone not replacing the milk once they finished it. So you've gone to make a coffee and the carton in the fridge is empty. And first just a biological reaction of anger happens. Now that's not our suffering, that's just a reaction to the situation. If the deeply ingrained belief in personal doership is there, what will accompany that anger almost simultaneously is judgment and blame. And so blame can look as simple as that. You send someone a message and they read it, you can see read or seen on Facebook, and then they don't reply. And you've asked a question and you're attached to the outcome, and you see, and then the story starts going, how rude, why aren't they replying? I wouldn't do that. And then the story might turn into guilt. Oh, they're not replying because they don't like me, and I guess something's wrong with me. And the guilt. It might seem not very profound in a way. It's like, oh no, he's talking about psychology or something like that. For a while I thought that. I went to see Ramesh after having very profound realizations of the essence of who we are, the nature of life as awareness and consciousness, thanks to the very profound teachings of Nisargadatta Maharaj, Ramana Maharshi, Wei Wu Wei, Lao Tzu, that dissolved a belief of life being as it appeared on the surface. And then I listened to these teachings, and at first I thought, this is very strange. I came to see Ramesh to pay my respects to Nisargadatta, thinking, because Ramesh was a translator for Nisargadatta, thinking that Ramesh, who is now giving satsang in Mumbai, not now, he's now dead, but he had been for 25 years. So I went to see him thinking he'd be saying the same thing. And I got there and I heard this and I thought, oh, this is a bit, kindergarten. And destiny, as it tends to do, conspires for us to receive what we need to receive. Conspired for me, I had only planned a one-day visit to India. Actually, it was 2 days, but it only gave me chance to go to one satsang. I put a stopover on the way from Australia to Europe. And as the situation turned out, this was in July 2005 in Mumbai, and it started raining that evening after my first satsang. And it rained and it rained and it rained, and the city flooded, and the airport was closed for 8 days. And so what would have happened was me leaving after the first satsang thinking, this really isn't for me. On the second day, I had all sorts of arguments. I had a discussion with Ramesh. We didn't see eye to eye. He said something, however, that stuck and kept going round and round and round until that evening it pierced through, and I realized that there was a layer of belief that was in the system and was preventing the movement going further. And so over the years that I spent with Ramesh, I started to see more and more how profound this set of pointers really is. It works in beautifully with the top-down perspective, if we come to see that. And it does a job that the top-down teachings can't do. It's very hard for a teaching to do everything. If it does everything, it loses its focus. It loses its concentration. It can't say one thing and then deal with the problem from another angle also. And what can happen is awakening can happen. And 20 years later, still there's a frustration because awakening has happened and yet seeking carries on. Uncomfortableness carries on. This is something Ramesh would point at often. He would find people coming to him with tears in their eyes, even after having profound realizations, because life hadn't, up to that stage, delivered the concepts that would help undo the error on this level, on the level of the body, in an efficient way. And why this happens is that certain spiritual concepts that need to be delivered in order to do a certain job tend to get turned into beliefs. And it's only when those beliefs are seen, and the nature of a belief is that it isn't seen to be there. Beliefs are sort of transparent when they're there. We don't know we have them. We know we have them when they collapse. That's when we realize that they were there, lurking. And so many teachings are saying this: don't believe the teaching as truth. Ramana has the great phrase, use this thorn to remove the thorn embedded in your thumb, but be sure to throw both thorns away. Thorn referring to a spiritual concept, and a thorn embedded in your thumb refers to a concept that's been turned into a belief. And he says it not so that you'd use the spiritual concept to undo the belief and then expecting them to be both thrown away, but because it's known that inevitably a spiritual concept will be delivered. It will be used to remove a belief in the thumb, and then it itself will become embedded in the thumb without us realizing it. So the saying is effectively saying, check, see if you threw both thorns away, or see if one replaced the other. So we know whether there is understanding based on whether there is peace of mind. Suffering is based on the misunderstanding, the false beliefs, the vasanas and samskaras that carry on are based on these false beliefs. So when it's said that even after awakening, the vasanas and samskaras carry on for a while, it's because the awakening can reveal the nature of life, and hopefully part of the working mind starts to now see that the old beliefs don't make sense, but they remain in place for a period of time. And they remain in place as the understanding. Tend to do that. There's a very specific framework being put forward. A lot of people might think, wow, remember, I don't want new conditioning. My purpose is to become deconditioned. It's not. If you wish to be deconditioned and you prayed to God, please decondition me, and He delivered your wish, you'd be in trouble. You wouldn't be able to function. How you use a knife and fork, how you drive a car, how you speak, calculate, is all based on conditioning. Conditioning isn't the problem except for a very specific type of conditioning. The conditioning that I've been talking about as the thinking mind, and it's the ingrained belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. Attachment to outcome meaning the belief that my completeness is to be found in outcomes. Personal doership, seeing myself and the other as separate independent entities, judging those actions that happen through me that deliver negative outcomes as my doing and feeling guilt and shame. Those actions that happen through me that are positive and judging them with pride, relating to them with pride. Look what me, have done, and I'm much better than you because you haven't done what I have achieved. And blaming the other in all sorts of different forms. So there's a microphone there. For the purpose of the recording, please use the microphone. If anyone has any questions or comments, it helps unfold the framework even further. So they're all very welcome. Yes. Just hold it for a second and the green light will come on.
Yeah. So it's not really a question, it's just an observation. So it sounds so beautiful because it gives the sensation that well, if you have the understanding, then basically everybody can get enlightened, because slowly and surely it will click.
Mm-hmm.
But the catch is that it will click only it is meant to click.
If it's part of the predetermined story of life, correct? Yeah? Exactly. And that can sound like bad news. But what we find is that, based on the principle put forward, if we surrender to the fact, I'm not in control, I'm not the doer, which sounds like bad news. It sounds like, well, if that's the case, then I can't control the understanding. It sounds like bad news, but the very fact of the surrender is the understanding. So as soon as the surrender happens, the understanding has just gone much deeper. And Ramesh would often say, when a comment just like you've put forward is put forward, he said, the other thing which is great news is that life, which we're not in control of, has stuck us in this room at this period of time listening to concepts that are not normally delivered by life. And so you're here not because of your doing, but because of the story of life. And so it means that your destiny is putting you, without you being the doer, directly in front of concepts that, in theory, are what is needed in order to undo the misunderstanding. So he said, no need to be pessimistic. In fact, you could look at that and be optimistic. If life has taken you this far, why should it stop now?
And it takes out the burden that, you cannot help. Either you get enlightened or you don't. It's not up to you. So.
It's not up to you, so we can relax. He would also say, because what you're saying is a very common comment based on the understanding, right? He said, yes, you can pack your bags up and go to the beach. If you go to the beach going, actually, all of this effort I'm putting in is not, especially if it's the effort of the doer trying to achieve something. If you find yourself in a place on spiritual pilgrimage because it feels right, it feels good, you like it, you enjoy it, then that's part of a movement that is not being driven by the doer. The doer in practice, like in practices, when there is a practicer of a practice, you're usually being driven to do something you don't actually like. You're going to sit in meditation for 2 hours because the doer thinks, when I perfect meditation, when I've done it hard enough, using my willpower, then I'll get enlightened. So when this realization comes, if you're doing a practice with that attitude, what it's really saying is, that's not helping. Real meditation actually kicks in when there is no meditator. When we meditate because we enjoy it. When we meditate because it delivers something that we see as positive. And so we do it because we feel like it. And then we're meditating, hopefully with a deep understanding, where we actually can allow everything to be as it is. See life as a happening. Meditation then can come into daily living. This is what it means, is life is a meditation, is simply walking through life, functioning as you would normally functioning, recognizing everything as a happening, including all of the movements of the body, all of the feelings arising, the thoughts arising, and you don't have to do it. You're off duty. It's happening. So you might notice that on my website or Facebook page, it's Roger Castillo, being lived. Life is living us, all of us. It always has been. It's only the non-recognition of this that creates the resistance. And that resistance, that doer, has never actually been driving the bus. It thinks it has. It's been freaking out about everything that's happening, thinking that it did it. And it's never been the case.
So, hi, I'm Darpan Majumdar. So one of the things I think is in surrendering, it's as easy as it may sound or as difficult it may sound, but it's a process. And the process is to be aware that one has to surrender. And the good idea could be to find some spaces where you actually can surrender. Because I think the experience of surrender can happen in some spaces. Space where you actually can surrender, and that space is safe for you to surrender, because with surrender there comes a vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And if that safe space allows you to surrender, and then to experience what happens post that, will reinforce the belief that what powerful surrender was at that moment. And then you will find more spaces and more opportunities to surrender.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what has been my practice, because many a times there are moments when you know, and suddenly you actually get an experience that this is a space where I can surrender.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So as more and more we find spaces for ourselves to surrender and experience the surrender, you will become much more mindful of this very aspect, which is what some of us on our spiritual journey is trying to achieve, to have that complete surrender.
Mm-hmm.
Like Ramana Maharishi had complete surrender to Arunachala.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just to possibly share, this is what helps me.
So on the note of surrender, it's important to see when surrender happens that it's not something that we actively do, but surrender is more the falling away of control. If we go through life saying, okay, now I have to surrender, it can become the opposite of surrender, where we are trying to surrender. So in moments when there is no surrender, and we start trying to surrender, and the surrender doesn't happen, and then we try harder, that actually becomes a movement in a completely different direction. Surrender is when it's like, I can't do this. It's a realization of the mental movement that is the opposite of surrender. Even the intention, we have a good intention to surrender. And the realization, surrender is a falling backwards in a sense. Yeah. But what you said, so I wanted to make that point just to clarify that surrender isn't a doing, it's the opposite of doing, where we surrender to God's will essentially. I surrender my will to God's will. But what is particularly pertinent about what you say is the fact that we gain more and more courage or enthusiasm in going in a direction that the mind didn't expect would deliver anything, by actually seeing the fruits of that movement. And so in this teaching, one of the core is the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And so the more times we find that there is a negative outcome, pain, and a resistance to that pain, and then in a moment, if we're lucky, the thought comes up, no, my happiness, my completeness is not dependent on outcomes, and there's a surrender surrendering our attachment in that moment. We just drop into being, and then this peace happens. And the more times that movement happens, the more we get confirmed for ourselves that my completeness isn't in achieving, isn't in controlling. My completeness is in completely the opposite direction, where the thinking mind wouldn't have ever thought it was to be found. So yes, this personal experience, seeing of the peace from surrender or the peace from attachment being cut off, is very important. That's part of the understanding going deeper and deeper based on your own experience, not just someone saying your completeness is not dependent on outcomes. When you start experiencing your completeness independent of outcomes, then the understanding is going deeper and deeper.
And also in this case, you yourself actually experience that yes, this is a space to surrender. There is that state of awareness which comes. So it is actually there is a voice within. So in the practice of mindfulness, there is an awareness which actually tells us, yes, I think I feel safe to lay back, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens and so therefore there is no doing there.
Mm-hmm.
Because it just, you seems to be like that plug which is going to fit into that socket.
Yes.
It is there. It's almost like the magnetic force of negative and positive.
Mm-hmm.
At that very moment, you're just aware that I am surrendering, but that very moment when you're into it, you realize that it is some sort of a voice which tells you.
Yeah. So instead of saying I am surrendering is happening. Surrendering happened.
Surrendering happened. Yeah. And one of the best things one can do is, so for example, there are many spaces which may not be available for us to surrender. So I do something, I hold spaces for people called Swavarta. Swavarta is a Sanskrit word which is talking to oneself. And consciously, if we can have a conversation with our own self, verbalizing it, and not in the mind, because it metamorphosizes into something concrete, because there is a sound. And if you can surrender to that, maybe to begin with having a conversation with oneself, that could be also a very interesting experience for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Just to have surrender to yourself, to the self which many a times we are not experienced in any other way, but maybe just in terms of sound. So talking to oneself, so you know, and that is another way of my experiences. My experiences of surrendering started with a lot of surrendering to myself through talking to myself. Literally, like I'm doing my Swavarta as I'm speaking to so many other people.
Right, yes. Yeah. And this is a demonstration of how there are so many different methodologies and paths. And sometimes we can take the methodology or the path as truth, and in the end we find it's actually a methodology, and so there's the different methodologies. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have like a question, I guess, just my experience. I think I had there were loads of expectations of what that sense of I am would look like, you know, what the feeling of happiness or peace of mind is. And so that flip-flopping process has been happening, the relatively peaceful, and then something happens, And for a while, I guess like my mind was having a hard time landing on which form of suffering is this. Like, is this guilt or blame? Like, it all felt just like mumbled together as that feeling of discomfort. But that is what it was seen as, like, oh, there's that feeling again. There it is. But even in like the last few days, there's been the realization of, oh, like, you know, maybe this is it. Like, at certain periods when the forms of suffering weren't there. And it's so interesting because all the times I had heard things like, oh, this is absolute love and this is absolute peace and all these things, it's like I had this idea lodged in my head of what I thought peace of mind or happiness had to look like. And just realizing that was another expectation, like that was another image in my head of what I thought happiness was. That is kind of currently what's happening. And so even though there's still the flip-flopping, like it's happening at such shorter intervals that it's just decreasing very fast. So that's all. So.
Yes, that's it. And that's a sign of the understanding going deeper. The understanding will start cutting off suffering quicker and quicker and quicker until such time as the understanding is complete, and then the suffering doesn't even get a chance to arise. So in practical terms, people would sometimes come and talk to Ramesh and tell them about all sorts of experiences and insights and this and that, and he wasn't really interested in all of that. At the end he'd say, so tell me, how is your peace of mind in daily living? That's what he wanted. He was interested to hear that. If someone said to him, Ramesh, I still have suffering, but it gets cut off within 5 minutes of it starting. Or someone, whereas before my day was filled with suffering, and now maybe 15% of my day has suffering in it. He'd go, now that's what the change is. That's peace of mind in daily living. And when the suffering ends completely, which can happen and we might not even notice, we might look back after 6 weeks or 6 months and realize, actually, I haven't been suffering in life. Life has continued to unfold more or less as it did before, but I'm not suffering. Then it might dawn on us, oh, this is it. And so if someone said that to him, Ramesh would say, he would go, this is what I'm talking about. Yesterday evening at one of the restaurants here, I heard someone saying, you know, there aren't enlightened people around at the moment. He said, no one is close to enlightenment. And I was listening, and he goes, you know, even Ramana was, you know, but he said, no one is even close to Ramana. And his idea of enlightenment, after I listened some more, was something very, very different to what I'm speaking about. It was some idea that is given in, well, you know, some teachings. There's a reason for it. There's a reason why it's described like the greatest of greatest of greatest things. It actually is the greatest of things. The end of suffering is when it's there, we realize that's all I was ever looking for. But it's very simple. What got me interested at some point was when I read a description. It says, your true nature, which you've forgotten, is brighter than a billion suns. And I loved puzzles, you know, I'd like solving puzzles, and I'd put all puzzles aside. I go, well, in this case, this is the puzzle I'm going to try and solve now. This seems like something worthwhile to dedicate myself to. When the process moved on and the descriptions started being different to that, it was still a puzzle worth solving. And it turns out it's not a puzzle that I solve. The solving happens as the process goes on. I've often said if I had to control this, if it was my doing, I would have messed it up in day 2. So there's a reason why enlightenment is something very different to what it really looks like is out there. I was really interested listening to the conversation yesterday. It showed me, wow. And when we interpret things a little differently, when we start to see what's in between the lines in teachings, we see actually it's talking about what I'm talking about. In Buddhism, enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. The cause of desire is attachment to outcomes, really meaning that the cause of suffering, attachment to outcomes, means the belief that my happiness, my completeness is to be found in outcomes. And the movement, the vasanas and the samskaras, that keep us looking outward and not resting in the space of being that is the core of who we are. And I got another question the other day when I mentioned this quote. Where did the Buddha say that enlightenment is the end of suffering? In which scripture? The person was interested to see the quote. When I went to answer it, I had a hard time because it's not... There are some places that he made some specifics. There's a place where he said, I teach one thing, and that is, I teach about the suffering and the ending of suffering. The Pali Canon is the scripture that is meant to be the recording of the Buddha's teaching, and then a lot of other canons and scriptures after are added to by other people who are, at their time, monks that were recognized to be enlightened also. But when you look at the Buddha's main teaching, it was hard to answer because the whole thing is about suffering and the end of suffering. The Four Noble Truths, the recognition that life is suffering, the causes of suffering, the understanding that there is a way out of suffering, and the explanation of the way out of suffering. That's it, that's the Four Noble Truths, meaning the summation of Buddhism. So when someone was asking as if it's one quote mentioned somewhere that enlightenment is the end of suffering, I sort of had trouble. It's actually the whole thing. And so that's why this question, what am I really looking for in practical terms? I'm looking for happiness for the human being, and happiness for the human being turns out to be the absence of suffering. So therefore, if we become clear on that question, whenever we get lost, we can come back, what am I really looking for? I'm looking for happiness. Happiness is just peace of mind. Peace of mind is not dependent on circumstance, not dependent on the flow of life, but my attitude to the flow of life. And then the suffering that is coming from a different attitude starts to get seen. It's understood to be an error, meaning based on a misunderstanding. If it's there and it stays there, then the understanding that sees it as a misunderstanding also understands, yes, it's bound to be there if it's destined to be there. If it's there, it means my conditioning on some level still includes this misunderstanding of who I am. That's perfectly normal in this story of life. It seems to be a story of forgetting oneself, suffering as a result, and then a story of remembering and suffering coming to an end.
It's just a sharing of an experience I had. A couple of days ago, I had this feeling of being miserable. that sometimes we describe during the talks. And so I had this feeling of being miserable, and I stopped, and I had this thought: well, if God exists, then God has to be in this feeling of misery. And I looked at it, and I could see that actually it was a resistance to the feeling of being miserable that was the problem, and allowing it, that is actually just seeing it as it is and letting be as it is. Actually, it opened a space, I felt like, and I had this realization that if God is in the feeling of misery, then it's no longer misery.
Thank you. Yeah, great.
I hope that I can speak in English a little. All that days is also a sharing. All that days that the first day that I come, all was all changing. I was organized one room, no, that room, no. All it was the control, no? I am not the control of anything, any thought, nothing, no my body, no nothing. But today, this morning, I was doing meditation, and I see that I am not a doer, no? That I see very clear that my words, my seeing, everything wasn't personal, no? Very, very clear seeing that. Thank you so much. I arrived from there.
Thank you. Oh, on that note, because I don't want to keep people too much longer than is advertised, we'll bring it to an end. Tomorrow is actually the last satsang. I meant to, originally it was going to be the 12th as well, but there was an issue with the booking of the room. So tomorrow will be the last satsang, and then there's satsang in Pune for 2 weeks, starting on the 14th. Thank you.